All right.
Or if they have time to go, be encouraged to donate $350. Yeah. So now some local bars, because that's the floor. But then there's some local bars. For instance, just doing meetings. So you know you're going to a bar, you have to do pro bono. That's what Seminole County has the same, our county is here about that. Yeah, so certain parts of the state have said that that's important to them and they want to be members of the volunteer bar association. And some states can have mandatory Florida it's a mandatory bar association, but not mandatory.
All right. Well, it's a small group, but I think we will go ahead and get started since we're already a little over 6:05. Welcome to the audience. My name is Kevin Rabin. I'm the Director of Litigation from Three Rivers Legal Services. I'm joined today by James Lemieux, who's one of our senior staff attorneys with Three Rivers, and we're here to talk about a really important topic for our communities in Gainesville, and that is how to avoid foreclosure. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to go through a few things that will hopefully help you learn more about what foreclosure is and what are some of the key terms to understand, because honestly, the language of consumer lending and foreclosure can be really confusing and really ostracizing. It can make you feel like, I don't know what these people are telling me. What am I dealing with? What's happening? And we hope that you'll first learn a little bit more about the language of foreclosure. At least knowing more will help you be more prepared if it ever comes to pass. The second step will be talking about once it does happen at some point in a person's life, how do you avoid it? What are some of the strategies to employ to get away from foreclosure, both before a foreclosure case is ever filed, and in the unfortunate circumstance that one is, what can you do to end it while maintaining your home? And finally, we'll talk about some other options that are alternatives, like bankruptcy or some other options that unfortunately deal with the loss of a home, but maintaining some piece of equity or other benefit for you and your family. So again, we'll kind of go through things in turn, but with a smaller audience. I think obviously if there are questions, we'll take them as they come. There's plenty to talk about, so just bear with me as I have to reach over here. All right. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on is what a mortgage and what foreclosure is. So the most important thing to start with is remembering how most people come to own their homes in the United States. The vast majority of consumers in the United States cannot afford to pay for a home from their own savings. The reality of home prices in the United States, especially over the last 40 years, is that very few consumers can afford to pay it up front. The vast majority of consumers then have to access a loan to help pay for a large portion of their home purchase price. So for most people, I think they're familiar with the adage that you should be looking to pay 20% down, right? Most people recognizing that 80% of the purchase price of their home is going to have to involve a loan. But obviously for different people, there's different amounts that factor in. There's no one size fits all solution. But what happens when you get that loan is that there is a separate document that you're going to sign, and it's called a mortgage. A mortgage is a kind of loaded word. It's hard to understand. It's certainly hard to write. I mistype it all the time. But a mortgage at its very basic core is a lien. a type of record that shows that you took out a loan and the lender expects that if you don't pay that loan, that home will be sold to pay for it. It's collateral. It's a piece of property the lender can take in the event that non-payment occurs. And that's the easiest way to keep it in mind, is a mortgage is just a record that if you don't pay this debt, the home is next. The home will be sold in order to satisfy it. So foreclosure is the process through which that happens. In some states, foreclosure is a process that doesn't ever see a courthouse. Our neighbors to the north in Georgia, for example, they are what's called a non-judicial foreclosure state. And all that means is that there is no court or judge involved in their foreclosure process. Instead, it goes through a separate system. It's got some advantages for consumers. It's got a lot of disadvantages for consumers. Luckily for us in Florida, we are a judicial foreclosure state, meaning that every foreclosure case, with a very small exception that's not really worth noting, will have to go through the court system in order for a homeowner to lose their home through foreclosure. And important to that is that that process takes time. There are statutory and constitutional steps that have to occur along that way. And it's always important to know that foreclosure does not happen quickly. So there's plenty of time for a consumer to take advantage of options to avoid the final steps of foreclosure, even once it's begun. But as we'll talk about later, the sooner they act, the better their chances of preserving their home and their equity are. So there's a few key terms that are worth knowing as we talk through the process of foreclosure and alternatives and options to avoid it. The first thing is to know what principal is. Principal is just the amount of money you still owe on a loan. You borrow $50,000, the principal is the $50,000 you're agreeing to repay for the money that was lent to you. Very straightforward. The next step, though, for most loans is interest, which is the amount of payment you have to give to the lender in exchange for them giving that money to you in the first place. Interest, again, can accrue at different rates. It's usually annualized so that it's easy for them to track and then break down on what's called a daily rate. It makes it pretty simple to follow, and it makes it easy for consumers to, in some ways, double check the math of any lender. If the interest rate's 3%, it should be pretty easy to sit down and calculate that. Things get tricky, though, and where a lot of people get a little bit mixed up is when they see this other term called annual percentage rate. This was originally a term designed to help make things clearer for consumers about what credit costs. When you get a loan, how much are you really having to pay to access that loan? Unfortunately, I think it has been more confusing than helpful for most consumers, so I'll help boil down some really basic ideas here. If you ever see the term APR in a loan, it's likely going to be in a black box, one of 4 boxes at the top of the loan document. And it's going to have a rate that looks different than the interest rate. Usually the APR is going to be higher. And the reason is the APR is meant to capture the other costs of credit that you're paying the lender over time or at the origination of the loan. For example, a lot of lenders will charge, say, an $800 origination fee. Hey, we had to draft up the documents for this loan. We had to bug some guy in accounting to make sure that everything was correct. That, you are having to pay the cost of it. The lender wants you to pay them that $800. And so it's only fair that to make sure consumers know what they're being asked to pay back, that be included in this broad umbrella called an APR. So just remember, when you see an APR and it looks higher than what was promised to you, it's because something else is in there besides interest. And if that number's a lot higher than the interest rate, somebody's not telling you something very clearly. And that number should be a red flag and should be something to keep in mind. It's a footnote here in the foreclosure process, but it comes up because sometimes consumers will not be aware of how much fees get packed in when they first take out their mortgage loan, only to later find out that they have less equity than they think they did because of this. Another thing to talk about is this concept of escrow. Again, word that makes you go, escrow, I assume some kind of account. You're right. It's an account that a lender maintains where you pay them in advance for two things that they go and pay for on your behalf. They're a middleman in this situation. You're giving them some of your money every month, and they're putting it aside to pay for taxes and insurance. The property taxes are the most important one because that risks the property for both you and the lender. If the property taxes for a home are not paid and that persists for more than 2 years, then there's a high chance that the local taxing entity is going to request a tax sale. And if that tax sale goes through, you and the lender lose out because that home would be sold to satisfy the tax debt. So obviously, a lot of lenders are going to require that new homeowners escrow so that that never happens. They don't want that to ever be a risk of losing the property, or for you, the same problem. Homeowners insurance is also part of escrow. Now, usually for most homeowners, it's up to you to go find the adequate insurance you need, usually through a broker or some other person who can help you compare different quotes from insurance companies. But something to keep in mind is that number can change wildly across a year, right? One year, your homeowner's insurance costs and premiums may be $1,200, and the next year they jump to $1,700. So that may cause a mortgage payment to increase because of this. I think for a lot of people who haven't had a mortgage in the past, that can be a little bit weird. They expect that the number that they start with is going to be the same number for 30 years. And the truth is it's never the same number. It's always going to fluctuate a little bit. More at the beginning than at the end, but it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about foreclosure. The final thing that I want to talk about on this piece is, again, just reiterating that what a mortgage is, that it's that record of the loan and saying that this home is encumbered by this loan, and if this loan isn't paid, we expect to sell the home to satisfy that debt. There's a few other things to keep in mind as well. Mortgages are what are called secured debts. Again, that same concept I just mentioned. It's a record that if this debt's not paid, this item, a home and the land it's on, will be sold to satisfy that debt. That makes it secured. It's fixed to the property. That's in contrast to a lot of other types of debt, like credit card debt, signatory loans, online loans, where the only thing you're pledging in order to get that money is, well, if I don't pay this, my credit's going to go down, and you might be able to sue me to recover the money. So keep this in mind when we talk later about one of the biggest reasons and ways to avoid foreclosure. A lot of situations we've seen in Three Rivers as a program are situations where a homeowner gets into financial distress and starts prioritizing debts. There's only $1,000 coming into the house. We have to pay it all. We can't pay every debt. What do we pay? Too often we see people prioritize the unsecured debts versus the secured. And as we'll talk about, that's the opposite order. It should always be prioritizing secured because whatever it's secured to can be lost if it's not paid. Whether it's your home or your primary method of transportation, these are the bigger risks because without a home, everything else is harder. Without a vehicle to get you to work or to travel to the doctor, everything else is harder. So again, it can be really tough for people to see that when there's something big, like a massive medical debt coming in. But it's important to strategize if that ever arises. Bankruptcy is another thing we're going to talk about tonight. James is really going to focus on this piece. But bankruptcy is something that I think a lot of people just hear about. They don't really know what it is. It's pretty simple. It's a federal court proceeding where a person says, I can't pay all of the debts that I have. I have limited income and not enough to pay all the debts that I have. So I need assistance through the court to marshal together all of my income and assets and figure out how I can manage what debts I can and can't pay. James will talk about some of the distinctions between the two primary forms of consumer bankruptcy, chapters 7 and 13. But in short order, just remember, These are options for effectively trying to get a hold of a debt situation that's gone too far. Some other terms to remember: originator versus assignee. So an originator is the original lender that gave the money to the consumer to help them purchase their home. In most cases, both in Florida and throughout the United States, that lender goes away the second that money's given, because they usually don't collect money from the consumer after. That would require them to employ people to service the loan, to send out letters, to call the consumers, and that's not their business model. Instead, they sell the loans. Sometimes they sell them in giant bundles, thousands of consumers' loans all together, in which they put them into this big trust or security and sell the rights to benefit. And the way this works is it's kind of similar to a stock. A bunch of investors in the stock market can say, look, there's a bunch of performing home loans. I'll invest in that. And that way I own a stake in it. And as long as those people are paying their mortgages, I benefit because I get that money, the money that they're paying, that interest that they're paying on top of the principal that was lent. All that helps. And it's important to remember that that is the vast majority of how American mortgage lending works now. So it can confuse people a lot when they start with, say, Rocket Mortgage, right? That's who I went through to get my mortgage loan. And then the next time they turn around, about 60 days after closing, they find out that they have a loan servicer. Let's say it's, I don't know, James, what's a good one? Select Portfolio Servicing, SPS, or NationStar Mortgage Servicing. They'll find out that they have this other company involved, and it can get really disorienting really quickly, especially because that can happen multiple times over the course of their mortgage, sometimes twice or three times in the same year. This is permissible, and we'll talk about how that can be a problem that leads to foreclosure as well. And again, a loan servicer is a company that services a loan. Their job is to collect payments, to send out notices, to send out monthly statements, to collect money in the escrow accounts and pay those taxes, and to pay for the property insurance premiums, and to contact and be a point of contact for the consumer in the event that anything else comes up. However, in my experience, loan servicers are as much a source of solution as they are a source of problem. So one important thing to know is know your servicer. If you have a mortgage, anybody, whether you're totally fine and you're in the best economic shape you've ever been in, you should know all about the loan servicer you have. Because if something does go wrong, you need to know what steps to take to address it, because some of them are a lot better than others about helping you out. And some final things to just touch on, because there are other terms that come up in mortgages a lot. A promissory note, or a note, is the actual debt instrument. We talked about the mortgage earlier, but the mortgage is part of two pieces of a whole. The mortgage is the record of the debt that says if this isn't paid, the property gets sold at a foreclosure sale. The note is the actual debt itself. And this is the thing that gets sold and transferred, is the note, the underlying obligation that you sign to repay money. And it can be a little confusing sometimes because the note, unlike the mortgage, is never recorded. You will have a copy of it from closing. When you close on your home, you are required to receive a copy of that note. But if you lose it for some reason, which I think all of us have lost something in our home at one point or another, there's not necessarily going to be an easily accessible copy for you to find. You're entitled to request from your loan servicer, and you can always do that. But it's important to know that that contains very critical information about your loan. It says how long your loan is going to last for and how many months it's going to take to repay it. The typical terms of these loans in mortgage lending is 10, 15, and 30 years. That note will say for sure which of those three it is. It'll also say what the total amount of the principal to be repaid is, and it will say what the interest rate is. And that's why it's so critical, is it really describes the majority of the loan itself. Together, and you'll hear me refer to them like this, they are, note and mortgage, the mortgage loan. And I really stress thinking of it like that because they only work if they're together. The note is just a question of debt. The mortgage is enforcement against the home. They work together in tandem. And the final term that everyone needs to know is default. Default is what happens when a homeowner falls behind in their payments. And they fall behind by a sufficient amount that at this point, the lender can declare that the loan is no longer performing. You are not going to be able to repay this because for, in most cases, 4 months, you have not been able to maintain timely and complete mortgage payments. And this is usually the most critical stage for homeowners because this is when a loan goes from a pre-foreclosure process and heads to an attorney's office to become a foreclosure case. So it's important to recognize that that 3-month to 4-month mark is maybe the most important 30 days for every homeowner if they ever find themselves behind in their mortgage loan. The foreclosure process is pretty straightforward, and this goes in detail, but it flows pretty quickly. Once a consumer misses a payment, that is the beginning. Now, if they cure that payment and they're able to get it caught up a few days later, no problem. There's a late fee in most cases for that, but once that's paid, they're good. The loan is back in full order. Everyone can move on and proceed. But if the consumer misses a second payment in a row and is now 60 days behind, and finally misses that third payment and reaches 90 days, then in many and almost all cases, the mortgage lender is going to send out a notice that reminds the borrower, after a few previous notices, that this is kind of the final moment to cure this default in payments, or they will accelerate the whole balance of the loan. Acceleration is basically an idea of we take that whole obligation that you agreed to pay us back over 30 years, and now we're going to make it due all at once. They're allowed to do this. In fact, they're required to do this in order to try to collect all of that money. And it's a common step that happens. It's not automatic. They have to give you notice in almost every case that it's coming. But that's why it's so important in this 90 to 120 day window to take action. Because once acceleration happens, it gets a lot harder to put the brakes back on and restore that loan to its increments over time. A few other pieces in this process to think about is once it reaches 120 days, it gets referred to that attorney's office to file a foreclosure suit. Once it's filed in either county or circuit court in Florida, depending on how much money's at issue, that's when the case is begun. They pay a filing fee. The court issues a document called a summons that gets sent to the homeowner and anyone else who might be living in the home. The lender has to take efforts to identify any other person who might be in the home, who's an adult, whether or not they are part of the loan. They also have to try to identify any heirs if they come to learn that the person whose loan this was passed away. They have to take a lot of steps to try to ensure that anyone who has a legal interest in that home gets notice about what's coming. They also have to notify any other lien holders who might lose their liens because of this mortgage lien. This happens in some cases, say if you get some home repairs 6 years into a mortgage loan and somebody has to record a lien against the home for that cost. You finance it to say fix a roof. Then they will also have to notify that company in order to make sure everyone knows what's about to happen. Everyone has to be brought into the proceeding. The next thing after service of the lawsuit on the consumer is the consumer has their opportunity and their requirement to file a response. Like any other civil case, they have 20 days to file this response after they're served. That's about 3 weeks. It's not a ton of time, but it can be extended for good reasons. And in many cases, this timeline becomes a little bit longer so long as the consumer is trying to take some action and letting the court know they need that additional time. But after a response is filed, is when things start to pick up pace a little bit. The court starts setting case management conferences to try to get an idea of how much longer it will take before everyone is served, and if there's defendants who have been served, how long before everyone has filed their responses or hasn't filed a response within the time provided. Once all of that is cleared up, usually taking anywhere from 3 to 5 months, then the court starts to try to press the case to what's called trial. I think everyone's familiar with what a trial looks like and what court trials are. I think everyone's probably familiar with those. These are usually non-jury trials in front of judges or magistrates, and the court tries to push them in that direction as quickly as they can once everything else is done. Once they arrive at trial, though, they then have to be adjudicated on their facts. In many cases, the lender is going to be in a position to prove its case, because its case is pretty basic. This person agreed to pay back money, they failed to pay it, they defaulted, and because they haven't done anything in the meantime to fully cure by paying off the entire balance of the loan, we're entitled to take the collateral property and sell it to satisfy the debt. If they win that case, they get what's called a foreclosure judgment, which allows them to obtain a sale. The clerk sets a sale date somewhere between 30 and 120 days after the judgment is entered and begins publicizing that sale. Once the sale occurs, then the property is transferred to either the highest bidder at the auction, or if no bid is higher than the lender's loan balance, the lender themselves. And once that transfer happens after sale, the homeowner is no longer a homeowner. At that point, they're now just a possessor of that property. And the final step in this process is the new owner requesting that that person be removed through a writ of possession. That process, once it gets to that point, happens in a matter of days and hours, no longer talking weeks. In total, most judicial foreclosures in Florida take somewhere between 6 months and 18 months to take place for all of these steps to transpire. So it's important to know that that's a broad range of time. A lot of things can come up and change that timeline. But I think all of us recognize, especially after the last few years with the pandemic, time flies. It moves fast. And things can really start to snowball, that 6 to 9 to 18 months can go by in a flash. So that's the process. Some basic terms we'll be talking about throughout this, but now let's get to the actual action of how do you avoid foreclosure? What do you do if foreclosure is imminent or is already on your doorstep? There are a list of different options, and these are sorted mostly into a sequence of time. Forbearance is an early option. This is something that happens right as soon as you fall behind, maybe even before. Whereas reverse mortgages, cash for keys, short sales, those are last-ditch efforts just before a final judgment of foreclosure or a sale occurs. So think of this as a spectrum of time. The more favorable options, the things that are easier and less costly for consumers, start up here where it's earlier in time. The harsher ones, the ones that involve loss of equity in the home, happen later in time. And it's important to keep that in mind. And when we talk about getting involved in early intervention, this is what we talk about. Forbearance is the simplest of all avoidance options. A forbearance is simply the lender's agreement that you don't have to make the December 2022 payment. You call into the servicer and say, look, I've had a death in the family. I have to travel and I'm unable to work for a few weeks. And because I'm not going to have income for those weeks, I'm not going to be able to make my payment in December. The lender understands and they say, oh, well, we can offer you a forbearance. We won't make you pay that December payment. We won't hold you accountable if you miss that payment for now. Okay. So what comes with that? On the plus side, the payment can be skipped. The lender has given its consent for you to forbear this risk, and at that point, you don't have to make that payment. But it doesn't mean you don't have to make it ever. It means you didn't have to make it in December. In many of these cases, the lender will then tell you, well, what we expect is that you'll make 2 payments in January. You'll catch up the December payment in January, giving you some time to get back on your feet. As you can tell, this isn't the best option in the world because at the end of the day, you're still going to owe the money. And now it's going to be 2 payments. And if you're operating on a fixed amount of income or you have a lot of fluctuations in your earnings, this can become a trap. It can become really easy to take advantage of skipping a payment only to find that the next payment that comes due is larger than you can handle. And you'll hear from the servicers in this case, we won't take a partial payment. That forbearance wasn't designed for that. Where we've seen a lot of confusion here is, I think when people hear forbearance, they think deferment. Deferment's different. Deferment is, I'm going to allow you to skip your December payment, and we're going to put it at the very end of the mortgage loan. We're going to shift it around. We're going to send it all the way to the back of the queue. And that can happen. Some cases, mortgage loan servicers will agree to a deferral, but it's very rare. It's exceedingly rare. In fact, I have never in the 10 years I've been practicing seen a single example of a loan servicer agreeing to deferment. It usually only happens when they're required to because of the nature of your mortgage loan. If, for example, you have a federally backed mortgage loan by the VA, in some cases the VA requires them to defer a payment instead of offering a forbearance. Where their hands are tied, they may have to do it. But in most cases, they're going to offer something that's more favorable for them. They want the money that they expected to get, and they'll give you a few weeks, months of missed payments maybe, but they're not going to wait that much longer. And they're not going to kick the can down the road and place it at the end of the loan. And it's just important here, I think, for most consumers to know what that difference is, so that if you're asking a servicer, hey, I want to explore these options, that they don't mislead you. Because another thing that I have seen is replete examples of mortgage servicers giving forbearances and consumers thinking it was a deferral. So just keep that in mind as one of the big risk factors. It's a great option if you have a short-term loss of income, but it's not really good for many other things because of the risks with making 2, 3, or even 4 payments all together at once. So another next step is curing default. So this is in a situation where, say, there's 2 missed payments, maybe 3 missed payments. And at this point, it's starting to become worrisome for the consumer, right? They're starting to fear what's happening next, right? How do I possibly catch up? I've missed 2 payments of $1,000 already, and now they expect another. I'm looking at $3,000 plus some late fees. How do I get this done? One of the best things, and this is where I have to highlight our partners at the City of Gainesville, is there are a lot of good mortgage intervention programs run by local municipalities for people who find themselves in these scenarios. And that is the perfect time to reach out. When you get later in the process, the amounts that are going to be required to get back to where you need to be are going to be very high, sometimes beyond what these intervention programs can possibly assist you with, so that you'll have to make up the difference with other assistance, other money of your own. But if you find yourself in a position like this is the prime time to seek assistance, and not just from community organizations or from local municipal government programs. It's a good time to reach out to the people in your life who can help you. I had a client who was saved and helped herself get out of a possible foreclosure situation because she came and told her congregation that she was in trouble. And they put out a call and said, hey, she's in trouble. Can people help her out? And people answered the call. It wasn't a ton, but that's all she needed, was an extra little bit to help get her over the hump, to get her back so that she could cure that default. And she avoided foreclosure. That's the best case scenario. I mean, I love that story because it shows how much the community can come to the aid in a time of need, which in turn makes people feel more comfortable about coming when they are in a time of need. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. And again, it's at an early stage before fees and other charges become so high that it becomes difficult for a consumer to get themselves out of default. The next one is reinstatement. Reinstatement can happen really any time after a loan's in default. Up until the moment that a court enters a foreclosure judgment, reinstatement's an option. It gets more expensive the longer a case goes. Because at first, reinstatement is just that curing of default, what we talked about earlier, right? Principal, interest, that's it, plus some late fees and any missed escrow payments. But once it hits a courthouse, now you're going to have court costs, the filing fee for the foreclosure case, the summons fees to the sheriff's office, any publication fees to a newspaper to get the word out. Another thing would be any attorney's fees, and this is where a lot of our consumers see a huge problem. The attorneys who file foreclosure cases love that they can shift their costs to the consumer, and they will do so. And sadly, your mortgage not only allows them to do it, but it says that if you want to get back out of foreclosure, you're going to have to pay those costs. So it's a great option because, especially early, it can help. Those costs are going to be quite a bit more than you would have hoped. I would say on average with foreclosure cases, a month in, the extra cost to reinstate from an attorney alone with costs and their fees is about an extra $1,500. So it's a pretty sizable chunk that comes immediately with the filing of the case. And that only grows over time. But it's an incredible tool to use if you are able to get the money together. Again, using those resources we described before, getting any kind of resource together to assist you in avoiding, these are the best options because they get your loan back to where you would have been if you had never fallen behind. That's the ideal. That's why these options are so good. Another is refinance. I will stress that refinance isn't as good as the other ones because here you're going to have to give up something more than just paying some extra money. Now we get into the tricky question of giving away a piece of your equity. I think everyone here is familiar with what equity is. I think just raise a hands, anyone does not know what equity is? Okay. So equity is just the value of your home that you own, that no other loan out there is attached to. This is, if the home is worth $100,000 and the mortgage is only for $50,000, the remaining $50,000 is your equity. It's your money, and it's your asset. But if you need to refinance in order to get out of a foreclosure, you're going to a new lender and asking them to help you out. Well, you've already shown them that you couldn't pay one loan, and they're going to use that against you. And what they're going to do is they're going to ask you to give up your equity in exchange for that refinance. So this can get a little dangerous because on the one hand, it's going to be hard to even access refinance as an option once you're in foreclosure. Just point blank, it's hard. When you fall behind, you take a credit hit. And the same lender is going to report to consumer reporting agencies that you failed to pay on time. And when that happens, this is what they're going to do. They're going to prevent others from lending you the money to cover their balance. So you got to know that going in, that they're going to use that leverage to try to get that access to equity. Loan modifications are the biggest one to avoid foreclosure. Again, all the other options I've been talking about involve paying the money that's been missed and plus some other charges. But for many consumers, that's just not feasible. Loan modifications are a way of taking your old loan and rearranging it using your equity, using your change in household income to possibly restructure the loan to allow you to keep your home. Now, in this one, you're going to give up equity. That's a guarantee. But you're trading your equity to keep your home. And how you restructure the loan is going to depend on what kind of options you're given. The earlier you are in your mortgage, the harder mortgage modification is because you have less equity to use. And more recently, you qualified for the loan. Your circumstances changing is something lenders are going to be a little bit more worried about. Whereas if you're 15 years into 30-year loan, you've proven that you can safely pay money. You've done it for 15 years. Something changed, and there's equity to use to help restructure things. Loan modifications also tie into these federal programs. If you have an FHA, a VA, or USDA loan, which you'll always know because it's a stamp on top of your note and your mortgage, it has a case number, it's pretty obvious. But if you have one of those, there's some enhanced options to assist with modification. There's this weird fun tool called the partial claim. I won't go into too much detail about it. But basically, the same entity that's providing insurance for your loan can prepay a part of your loan, and then you give them a mortgage. Now, you don't have to pay them until you hit the end of your first mortgage, and that's a huge benefit. It allows you to basically shift around your debt to an entity of the federal government that doesn't really want your money. They want you to stay in your home, and once you get to the end of your mortgage, then they'll figure out with you what the next option is going to be. They are nowhere near as aggressive, and they're not going to do anything to collect that money while you are still in your original mortgage. So it's just a cool thing to know. But in general, modifications are the most important tool to avoid foreclosure. So at this point, I'm going to give way to James to talk a little bit about bankruptcy. I think now's a good time to do a door prize, Donna, if we're good.
We should probably just do all three.
Yeah, since we have 3 audience members, we have exactly the right number.
And then you get to pick, so these are the door prizes right here. They're very similar, but a little bit different decorations, so all like household items. All right, so the first one, how about I lose a tick? First one, the last 3 numbers are 921. So who had 921?
First choice.
Okay, so you pick first of which one you want. And then the second one is 922. Second.
Number 2.
And 920, you'll pick third. You keep it. Sure, keep it for next time? Yeah. Well, they're fall, they're Thanksgiving, you might as well. Go ahead. Donate it to somebody if you don't need it.
It's the giving season.
Thank you so much. You're welcome.
Hello, my name is James Lemieux. As Kevin said, I'm a senior staff attorney at Three Rivers. I work out of our Jacksonville office primarily. We handle some counties in the north area. Also, potentially Alachua County doing bankruptcies. Over the last 2.5 years, I've been working on bankruptcies and also foreclosure defense, and it's a great tool to have in the toolbox to defend against foreclosures and other debt collection efforts. Can't really see my screen, but all right. So what a bankruptcy, what's the main purpose of a bankruptcy is to protect the honest but unfortunate debtor. So a lot of times people with the best intentions will take out credit. They might take a mortgage on a house, get some credit cards, get that car, and then something happens, they'll lose their job, maybe a spouse dies. It could be a lot of things that affect their ability to pay. And now the creditors are knocking on their door. They want the car back, they want the house back. They want to sue them on a judgment, garnish their wages, things like that. But because bankruptcy is a federal action, in that regard, it's superior to the state court. So under the federal constitution, it specifically provides that the federal government is going to be supreme over the states as to bankruptcy actions. So when you file a bankruptcy, either Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, It comes with a automatic stay, which is an injunction that tells every creditor, even state creditors like foreclosure courts, you can't proceed with collection while this bankruptcy is pending. And if somebody were to violate that, they could be held in contempt by a federal judge, and that tends to get people's attention. And it's not very often that somebody violates that stay. But you have to become, like in chapter 13, that's the purpose of that, is to keep your property, keep your, what Kevin was talking about, secured property like a house or a car that could normally be foreclosed on or repossessed by a creditor. In order to keep that, you have to either keep making the payments on it if you're current to begin with, or you have to enter into a payment plan to become current on it by paying the back balance. So the way to so secured property, you have to be current on it or make payments on a plan. But with unsecured property and debts like credit cards, payday loans, debts to a family member or something like that, you can have that debt discharged, which means you're no longer is responsible for that debt. All right, let's see if I have a button. Kevin changed my slide. I like that one better. So how do you declare bankruptcy? I don't know. You guys know The Office, and he's what's his name, Kevin?
Michael Scott.
Michael Scott. He's in trouble. He just says to The Office, "I declare bankruptcy." It's not that hard. It really isn't that hard to declare bankruptcy. But what it involves is filing documents with the court, and you just explain who you are and that you're filing Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, and providing some basic background information. And once that's filed, your bankruptcy is filed. Within a certain amount of time, you have to file some other things. You have to disclose everything you own, everything you owe, all of your debts, and all of your income. So all that stuff becomes public record. Most people aren't really concerned about that. I mean, people who aren't the debtor aren't concerned about that. They don't. Most of the time, people aren't going to know your neighbors or anything like that, because it's kind of hard to search for that. They wouldn't even know. But it is a public record, and who is concerned is the trustee. So that's one of the players in the bankruptcy. I wanted to let me make sure I'm hitting my points here. So can you qualify? So once you file a bankruptcy, a trustee is assigned. A trustee is a person who represents the interests of creditors, and they look over the documents and make sure that you've disclosed all of your assets, all your income, all your debts. They want to make sure that there's not any property that they could take to sell off or liquidate or dispose of to pay your creditors. The reason they do that is they get paid to do it. So some of the trustees get a commission from all the property they dispose of. Like in Chapter 7, they can get like 25%. So they sell a car, they can get 25% of that. So that's pretty much what they're looking for. Most of our clients don't have a lot to worry about. Most of our clients have all exempt property. Let me show you what is exempt. What can I keep? So if you think about, oh yeah, I have a question.
Could you explain the difference between Chapter 7 and Chapter 13?
Yeah, absolutely. So a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, it's called like a reorganization. It's probably easier if I explain Chapter 7 first. Chapter 7 is like a liquidation. You're going to the court saying, I can't afford my debts. I want to start over. If you have secured property, you have to either be current on it to keep it, or you have to basically turn it over to the trustee, and the trustee gets a crack at it if they want to give it back. But if you give it back, you don't owe the debt anymore. But there's certain things that you don't have to turn over even in Chapter 7. It's what's considered to be exempt. And exempt means the Florida statutes set out a whole list of things that even if you file a bankruptcy, it's beyond the reach of the creditors. And people think about it like a bucket. So once you have you file the bankruptcy and you list all of your property, it all goes into the bucket. But then you could say, okay, here's what's exempt, and you could pull it out of that bucket. The bucket basically belongs to the trustee. So if you say, if you don't have a house, the exemption is your house is exempt. And that's what's good about Chapter 13. So even in Chapter 7, if you're current on your house and you file the bankruptcy, you want all your credit cards discharged, medical debt. I was almost going to say student loans, but that's actually one of the exceptions. So all that stuff basically just goes away. It only takes like 90 days. You just file, a trustee's assigned, you have a meeting with the trustee, they ask you some questions about your pleadings. If they say, hey, everything here is exempt, they notify your creditors. You wait 60 days to see if any creditor objects, and normally they don't. If they don't, then the order of discharge is entered. Now, nobody can collect on you on those debts because they're discharged, and any credit report has to show there's a zero balance owed. But there are things like a car or a house, you have to be current on it when you file, and then you can keep it. There is actually something else too. I only have like 20 minutes, but basically, so say you have a car that you owe $10,000 on it, but it's broken down, it's got problems, you paid way too much, 20% interest. You could actually do a motion to redeem it, where you're asking the court to allow you to pay back the liquidation value, like the trade-in value of it. And if you can do that within 90 days, well, actually like 60 days, then you could keep that. Same thing with like Badcock furniture, rent-to-own TVs and things like that are like, way more than they're worth. So that, and you could also keep, if you keep your house, if you don't have a house, you get a wild card exemption. That's $4,000 personal property, plus everybody gets $1,000 of personal property, and $1,000 of equity in a car. And like Kevin talked about, equity is the difference between what's owed and what it's worth. So, but if you have like a car that's, say you owe $17,000 on it, it's only worth $16,000 on it, it's not subject to the trustee getting it because it doesn't have any value for the trustee to sell off. So it's protected. So sometimes you're going to file bankruptcy, it's not a good idea to like pay down the car. You might as well put that money into your house or into not really saving it, but like pay your utilities or something like that. So now 13, this is like what kind of the way to save a house, because you can, the traditional way to save a house in Chapter 13, someone gets behind, they're facing foreclosure, or they're behind on the car, they want to keep it, they don't want to get repossessed. If you file a 13, the same documents, but you just say, I'm filing 13, and you have to put in a payment plan, show how you propose to pay back these debts. You have to become current on the mortgage over a 3 to 5 year plan. So you're paying the back money in installment payments, and you're paying your ongoing payments as they become due, so that at the end of the bankruptcy plan, you're current. But what really, sometimes that's really hard to do because somebody can't afford their mortgage payment, they can't afford to make all these extra payments. But Florida has a mortgage mediation program so that you can ask to modify, you go through the modification process, submitting your documents as far as like through a web portal, and there's a mediator assigned, and so you're uploading your documents like the same mortgage modification packet and all that, and a lot of times the lenders will agree that you can modify that mortgage. So you've stopped the foreclosure, now you've modified your mortgage, and instead of having to continue the 3 to 5 year plan, you can just go to a Chapter 7 and get all the rest of the debts discharged. So it doesn't always take that long. There's some of the exempt property, like I said, like the house is exempt if you're current on it, $1,000 equity in the vehicle, $1,000 personal property, and if you don't have a house, $4,000 of personal property. But the value of that's not what you paid for it. It's like garage sale value or online thing like Craigslist value or something like that. So a lot of people have like sentimental attachment. Like I bought this is like a 48-inch TV and it's flat screen and I think it's worth $200. And well, you bought it like 5 years ago, and I can go to get a 60-inch plasma at Walmart for like $300, so it's probably not worth that. So that's all the things like a lawyer particularly can help. You don't have to have a lawyer to do this, but it's really helpful. I think I have another slide, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, I was talking about the mediation. Oh, important that during the mediation, instead of having to pay the arrears and the current payment, you only have to pay a third of your income or the last regular mortgage payment, whichever is less, while you participate in this mediation program, which can usually lasts about 6 months. So you're while you try to work it out, that's what you're paying to show good faith that you're not just delaying something. You could file all the way up until the sale date of the property. So like Kevin was saying, maybe it takes 6 months, 8 months, 16 months, and it didn't go your way. You did everything you could, and now you're looking. You like today, I didn't want to wait this long, but we filed a Chapter 13 bankruptcy about 5 minutes before the sale, 11 o'clock, because the lady hadn't taken her credit counseling course yet. But what you do, you have to take this like hour and a half long credit counseling course before filing. Did that, let the court know they had to cancel the sale, and we're on our way, where we're going there, but live to fight another day. So but it's a very powerful, useful tool. If you can take advantage of some of these other things, other tools inside the bankruptcy, you can come out ahead. It is supposed to be a fresh start, but if you can, in a Chapter 13, you can do a cram down of a vehicle. So say that you still have $17,000 on a car, but it's worth $8,000. You can pay the $8,000 over like 60 monthly payments instead of the 17 at like a really reduced interest rate, and come out owning that car and having the rest of that debt wiped out. It could stop garnishment right away. Sometimes you can get back some of the money that's already garnished, like within 90 days of the bankruptcy. Somebody's driver's license is suspended because of a motor vehicle accident, not enough insurance. That debt can be wiped out, and they get the driver's license back. There's a lot of options. It's very complex. There's a lot to it, but it's good to know that what it involves. You usually won't lose everything. A lot of times people keep everything and can still have those debts discharged. Does anybody have any questions?
So would Chapter 13 be the best way to go if anything, happens?
I would usually recommend trying like a modification, seeing what you can do to avoid the foreclosure that way. And a lot of times also it's wrapped up with, are there other reasons to file? Do you have a whole bunch of unsecured debts that creditors are trying to collect? Are you behind on your car payment? So you sort of look at those options. But if it comes down to, am I going to lose my house or not? Like I went into a forbearance and now they say $5,000 is owed and there's no way I can make that up. But I could make payments through a Chapter 13 bankruptcy and pay that arrears through the plan. Then that might be the way to go. It's hard to say without looking at everybody's particular details, but it is an option, particularly if somebody has some sort of stable income coming in or enough income that they can make monthly payments. But yeah, so sometimes it is the best way. And a lot of people are really relieved when they come out and have that bright line where they can start over and start building their credit, and their credit a lot of times goes up after filing, which is kind of bizarre. But there's always people out there wanting to lend money, and they know you can't file again for 8 years. So hey, all right. Well, thank you for your time. I'm glad to see you guys came out.
And James will be around for questions. So we're only got a few little quick things to touch on, and then we're just freely open for questions. The one thing I did want to highlight is just, it's not pleasant to talk about when you're talking about how to avoid foreclosure, because in some cases you can't. In some cases, these other options just won't work for various reasons. Again, I'm just going to pick from a client I recently had. His household income was $800 a month. The mortgage and everything else in his life, it was just never going to work. Financially, it was not doable. And so we did have good things to try, and we tried to get him a mortgage modification. We got really close, but again, his income was just a little too low. And we tried to take advantage of other options, but it just wasn't feasible. So when that happens, there are other options, though, to make the best out of a bad situation. And we'll start with a private sale, because sometimes if you can't save your home, the best thing you can do before the lender or their attorney try to scrape away your equity is sell it to somebody else and take away the most money you can. I call this if they are gonna sell it, you might as well make money too. And it makes sense, because at the heart of it, especially in a hot real estate market, appreciation of home values can happen really quickly. You might have bought a house in 2014 for $90,000 and thought, look, this is a good deal for me. Right now, that house may be worth $180,000. And so if you are just paying back the $90,000 over time you originally agreed to almost a decade ago, you've got equity. Even if you've not paid a ton of your mortgage off, you still have a good chunk of equity from the appreciation in value. And so sometimes it can be worthwhile to take advantage of getting that money and then using it for your next housing option, a down payment on a new mortgage, or rent for potentially a few months, if not a few years, depending on how much you get. And that is a good way to strategize that, knowing that the battle can't be won at the end of the foreclosure. How can I make the best of this and try to save what I can and keep myself housed, which is a critical strategy to think about throughout this entire foreclosure process. The other options kind of go down as things get a little bit hairier. You'll hear about a short sale. A short sale is what happens when you have no equity. You're basically trying to sell the home just to get out of it, and so the lender won't try to go after you for the money that you might still owe them because the house won't sell for enough. Short sales were pretty common during the foreclosure crisis. Back in 2008, when home values were so far inflated over reality that people were signing loans for $500,000 for a home worth $200,000. So when that happens, you're never going to sell it for what the lender is expecting to recover. A short sale is maybe the better option, where the lender agrees, okay, it sells for $200,000, we'll eat the rest. We're never going to get that money anyway. A deed in lieu is similar to that, although you don't always need a lender's consent with a deed in lieu, because you could just sign a deed in favor of them and it's their property. Doesn't get you out of the loan. The loan is still going to be there, but if you don't want to deal with the foreclosure process, well, yeah, now they can't foreclose because you gave them title. You already surrendered it to them. It comes with other perils, and that's why I wouldn't say go ahead and sign that. But it is another option that's very similar to a short sale. In this case, instead of a private party getting it in the marketplace, the lender themselves would take it and they'll dispose of it. They'll either sell it themselves or they'll, find an investor who's interested. The final option is the one I went with, that client who could not afford to pay because of the limited household income they had. And that's what we call cash for keys. At the end of the day, his home was underwater. He couldn't afford his mortgage. And in fact, the home had suffered serious storm damage that he could not repair. He couldn't get insurance, and his insurance company barely paid out anything, and he couldn't actually get it fixed. What do you do there? I mean, it's a home you can barely live in. You have to strategize. And so we looked carefully at it, and ultimately we pursued cash for keys. The idea that the lender is more willing to pay to not deal with the foreclosure lawsuit, the defenses, the time, and in exchange, they'll give you, the consumer, money to get out of the hassle. It's usually not a lot, so I don't want people to think like, oh man, this is how you get $100,000 for avoiding litigation. But it's something that can be a decent little chunk of change to help you make sure that you have somewhere to go. And it usually comes along with time in which to do that. So just keep this in mind as a potential final option that comes up. It's usually hard to do for a consumer alone as well. Usually they'll need an attorney to bargain for something like that. And as a final note, reverse mortgages, because this does come up occasionally. People think a reverse mortgage is a way to save a home. It is, but only for a select number of people. You have to be 62 or older to even qualify for a reverse mortgage. But they also don't really work well if you are very underwater in your existing mortgage. Reverse mortgages are basically you giving up equity to a mortgage company in exchange for not having to pay for certain things over the course of time, or to get money to pay off other things like medical bills or things. And that's why they're dangerous, because they're just generally not a great idea. But if you need one to keep your home into your senior years, you're 73, you're not going anywhere, and you want to die in this house. Some people, I totally respect that. Then this may be an option to explore to help save that home into perpetuity, because if it does work, you don't have to pay principal. You don't have to pay interest. The only thing you have to pay, taxes and insurance, and that's it. But it comes with other problems. You have to live in that home as your primary residence. And trust me, if you have to go into assisted living for a long period, they will try to say that you no longer live there. And they'll try to use that as a ground to foreclose. Another thing that happens is, because you're converting your equity, you're effectively surrendering your heirs' ability to inherit your asset. That generational wealth that's created through home ownership. Reverse mortgages devour it. Now, sometimes that's worth it. Look, if you are 75 and you built that home and you raised your kids, I know you want to leave your kids something nice, but if you're homeless, that's not worth much. So that's where a reverse mortgage can be helpful, but know the cost that then once you pass away, your children are going to have to pay off the entirety of that reverse mortgage loan, which is a lot of money, or they'll have to get it appraised and pay 95% of that number. And as you might imagine, for most of the heirs we're talking about, that's not going to be affordable for them. And again, for many of these cases, the home is also not in the best condition. Again, if you're elderly and you live on your own for 20 years, there's going to be things that don't get repaired, and that's fine. But it means that certain maintenance may not be done, and for your heirs, they may be required to overpay versus something they would be able to access otherwise. So just some things to keep in mind. But I really appreciate everyone's patience and attention to this. Both James and I were happy to be here tonight and to present. So at this point, any questions or any discussion that people want to have? I'll probably wrap up the presentation shortly and shut off the Zoom, but we'll be around as we break down. So
I wanted to ask,
yes, ma'am.
I think it was default, when you was talking about default.
Mm-hmm.
When, people get behind 3 payments or something, you know, and they can't afford to pay. And I think you said something about, they'll be asked to pay off the whole thing. Now, if they couldn't pay the, you know, if they was behind the 3 payments, how they gonna afford to pay off the whole loan?
Yeah, it's called acceleration. So basically, you know, a mortgage loan is broken down into payments, right? Because no one could possibly pay back all that money. Otherwise, they would have just used their own money. They would never have gotten a loan. So it's broken up into installments, let's say over 10 years. The purpose of acceleration is the lender is worried that because you've not been paying a loan now for 3 months in a row, you're never going to repay it. You're not going to ever catch up and actually finish this thing on time. And now you're going to risk their other investments, and it's going to cause these other effects for them. So the reason they accelerate is not because they're trying to help the borrower in any capacity. It's because they're basically saying at this point, we can't collect this money from the borrower. So now we have to give them the ultimatum. Pay it all off. Get a new loan from somebody else to pay this off, or whatever else you need to do, but we're done. This accelerates now, and you've got 30 days before that date, that moment in time happens, and we file a foreclosure case. The way to think about this, and what I was trying to get at, is those 90 days, those first 90 days after somebody falls behind are precious. That's the best time to solve any potential foreclosure issue. When you're in that 90 to 120 day period, that's really your last big chance, because the lender is required to warn you. And this is the warning they give you. if you aren't able to do this, we're going to accelerate and we're going to file the foreclosure. That's the last true opportunity to avoid these increased costs that come once the foreclosure occurs. Again, before the modern era, we'll go back to the late 1800s, a lot of these options I'm talking about never existed. These are creations of more modern eras to help promote and encourage and retain home ownership. But the original piece of this all comes from the basic, American tradition of property law and lending, which is pay the money back or you lose it. And that's part of why it's so harsh. And that's why, again, I'm really putting that focus on 90 days to 120. That's the last real big opportunity to save your home.
And then to, the one way, okay, say I couldn't pay I asked for, I told him that I couldn't pay my payment for this month.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know you said something about I have to make 2 payments, the payment I missed and the next month's payment.
Right.
Okay, I know you say a lot of places, they, won't put that payment to the end
Correct.
of the loan. But seem like, to me, that would be a better.
I fully agree.
At the end of the loan than you having to double up.
Absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, it reflects the priorities here with why think about whose choice this is. It's the lender's choice, right? A lot of times, lenders are going to make the choice that behooves them, unless the law requires them to do something that's more moderate, that favors both them and the borrower, or just the borrower. So you remember during that I mentioned in certain situations, like with VA loans, the VA has commanded, no lender, you've got to shift this thing to the end. We're going to make you do it. That's where that really kicks in. And that's why it only rarely happens, is because unless, in this case, the federal government is forcing them as a condition of participating in their program to do that, they're not going to. It's in part because the sad truth of a lot of foreclosure is lucrative. Banks make money in foreclosure. They make money because there's additional fees and charges they can include. This is why I mentioned that time before foreclosure is so precious, because there is this whole umbrella of extra fees they can charge under what they call default servicing. When you're in default, they can make more money from you. And as sad as that seems, they're more interested in making that money than they are in trying to help you out. Now, this isn't true of every lender, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. But that's why it's so important. One of the biggest things, and this is in the pamphlets, you can't be embarrassed to talk about this openly with your friends, your family, with those who are part of your faith, in order to make sure that everyone can know early on, this is a problem, how do I solve it? Because the earlier you find a solution to help get yourself out of that, you avoid this entire system that they're trying to push you towards. And it helps a lot in trying to avoid the entirety of foreclosure. A lot of times, Donna has done this for 30 years of seeing consumers come in way too late in the foreclosure process. James, the same for nearly 20, and me for a decade. We've seen it so many times. A very salvageable situation that wasn't saved because somebody just didn't act fast enough. And I know, I don't blame anyone for that. It's life. Life comes at you in a million different ways, but I can't stress enough how important early intervention is. And that's why, again, with programs like what the city of Gainesville runs, it's critical to reach out to those folks in these early stages. Because when you can, those amounts are smaller, they're easier to fix, and the cascading fees and other charges don't appear. They can't get to them when there are these more effective early intervention steps.
So if the city of Gainesville or NHDC Neighborhood Housing is not able to assist the homeowners, we can refer them to your office?
Yeah, go ahead.
And how soon would they will their foreclosure situation kind of like be taken as a priority and you all jump on it right away?
So the way that our office handles this, and this is consistent with most legal services programs in Florida, we consider foreclosure or people at risk of foreclosure as a high priority. It's one of our top priorities is housing. We separate that in two camps: rental housing, ownership, but they're coextensive, both high priorities. So if somebody's already been served with a foreclosure suit, we have to prioritize that over somebody who hasn't, simply because now there's court deadlines. There's risks to them of losing that home more quickly than others. However, we can do more in most cases to assist somebody who's coming earlier. Somebody who maybe is 2 months behind, started getting those scary looking notices mentioning you're in pre-foreclosure, or we might refer this to an attorney soon. They've maybe contacted NHDC or the city and said, hey, I need help with this. That's a prime time for us to be involved, because at worst, we can help give guidance. We can give advice. Here's what to navigate. Here's what to look at. We think you might qualify for a loan modification because your income looks like it would work for that. We can look at these things and really consider them and take the time to do it. Because once we're in a foreclosure, well, we can still do some of those things, but now it's more expensive. The number of assistance programs that are available might not be available at all. In the case of things like the homeowners assistance funds that the state had, those went in literally a week. They were gone. So a lot of those needs-based programs are in high demand. So if you need them, you got to act quickly and try and get on top of it. But as a law firm, our job is to just do as much as we can with the cases, and we're always going to prioritize them. I mean, James mentioned the bankruptcy we filed this morning. We've been working on that case the last week, and it involves multiple efforts at a trial court in Duval County, an appeal to the First District Court of Appeal in Tallahassee, and now the Federal Middle District's bankruptcy court. So we take a full approach to try to save our clients' homes as best we can. I think I saw a question.
Yes. What are the requirements to utilize you guys' services there at Three Rivers?
So most of our services are income-based. Most of our client screening is going to require that people fall within certain degrees of what are called the federal poverty guidelines. Our primary funding source, the Legal Services Corporation, is federal funding, and it comes with strings that limit who we can assist. However, those same strings don't attach to every grant we have. Specific for seniors and any person who's over the age of 60, or any person who's over the age of 55 and cares for a child that's not their own biological child. Again, very technical, but look, if you care for your nephew and he is in your house and you have cared for him and you're the one feeding and sending him to school, we can assist those clients who are 55 and older as senior caregivers, or 60 or older without that condition, regardless of their income level. So we do have different grants that allow us to do different things. We have a special grant from the city to do eviction defense for people, and those income levels are actually a little higher than our standard ones. We had a bankruptcy grant specifically that went even higher as well. I think it was at 275% of poverty. And as our funding changes, we're always looking for more opportunities to both get additional funding to help more people, usually with higher limits if we can find them, but also so that we can retain more staff to continue to work on and assist clients. But the best thing I can say is if anyone's interested in our services, they give us an online application, our website, trls.org, or they give us a call at either the toll-free number and I just put the Gainesville office number, but we have a local number for all 3 offices. So it's just critical that people reach out as soon as they think they have the problem. And especially with foreclosure or anything related to mortgage issues, those all fall within our high priority. Absolutely.
Everything that you talked about, is it in this?
Yes, ma'am. Now, it's not going to be as extensive and detailed, and trust me, it's not as long-winded either. But it's very clear. And 2 of those pamphlets that I gave are from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That is a federal agency that was created about a decade ago to help consumers with all kinds of matters related to lending, including mortgage lending and foreclosure. They are an invaluable place to turn for information, and they are the regulator that in many ways is out there trying to stop servicers from doing bad things. They have their limits, and let's just say the mortgage industry doesn't like them very much for very obvious reasons. But they're an incredible resource for consumers in all arenas. They do everything under the sun.
Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and take care.